AI scanned every crop circle on Earth. What it uncovered left everyone speechless. Somewhere in the English countryside, a farmer is standing at the edge of his own field, and he is not moving. He has walked this land for 30 years. He knows every slope of it, every low corner where water pools after rain. And this morning, none of that matters, because sometime between last night and dawn, something pressed a shape into his wheat so precise, so enormous, so perfectly formed that his first instinct is not wonder. It's suspicion. Not of a person. Of the idea that no person could have done this at all. This is the story of what happens when someone finally stops arguing about crop circles and starts actually measuring them, feeding 50 years of these formations into a machine built to find patterns humans miss, and asking it one honest question: is there anything real here, or have we been laughing at nothing for half a century? The answer that came back did not sound like nothing. For most of modern history, crop circles have been treated as a punchline. Two men with a plank of wood and a length of rope, a few pints at the pub, and a good story to tell the tabloids. And in plenty of documented cases, that is exactly what happened. Human hoaxers have stepped forward over the years to demonstrate, in daylight, how a flattened ring can be pressed into a field with nothing more exotic than basic tools and patience. That part of the story is real, and it deserves to stay part of the story. Skepticism earned its place here. But skepticism has a habit of doing something sneaky. Once it wins a few rounds, it stops looking. Once the public decided crop circles were a joke, most people quietly stopped paying attention to the shapes themselves. The debate calcified into two teams shouting past each other. Aliens on one side, pranksters on the other, and somewhere in the noise, an actual question got lost. Not who is doing this, but what exactly is being made. That is the question this investigation decided to take seriously, using a tool that has no stake in either team winning. The idea started small. A handful of researchers with backgrounds in machine learning and pattern analysis, the kind of people who spend their days teaching software to notice things humans overlook in medical scans, satellite imagery, and financial data, got curious about crop circles almost as a side project. Not because they believed in anything supernatural, but because it struck them as strange that such a large, photographed, geographically widespread phenomenon had never really been analyzed the way a dataset should be analyzed. So they built an archive. Thousands of documented formations, spanning back to the late 1970s and stretching across dozens of countries, each one tagged with whatever metadata could be reliably gathered. The date it appeared, the location, the crop type, the weather conditions in the days before, and where possible, whether that particular formation had ever been claimed by a human hoaxer. Then they did something almost boring in its simplicity. They didn't ask the software to look for aliens. They didn't ask it to look for hoaxes either. They asked it to find structure, geometric complexity, symmetry, repetition, information density, and report back honestly, with no framing, no leading questions, no thumb on the scale. What came back was not a message. There was no line of alien text, no coordinates, no smoking gun proof of anything otherworldly. If you were hoping for that kind of clean, cinematic reveal, the data never delivered it, and it's worth saying plainly, nothing here proves extraterrestrial contact, and nothing here should be treated as confirmed fact rather than an intriguing analytical exercise. What the system did find, however, was a shape in the numbers that nobody on the research team expected, and that took them a while to feel comfortable saying out loud. When you plot the geometric complexity of these formations against time, not case by case, but across the full decades-long span, the line doesn't wander. It climbs. Slowly at first, then less slowly, then in a way that made more than one person on that team go back and double-check their own math because it didn't look like noise. It looked like a trend with a direction, and if there's one thing that unsettles a data scientist more than chaos, it's order that shouldn't be there. To understand why that climbing line felt so strange, you have to go back to where this all supposedly began. The earliest formations on record, from the late 1970s, were almost laughably simple: a single flattened circle in a field of wheat or barley, no rings, no branches, no internal structure at all. Just a smooth, swirled patch of crop lying down in one direction, as if something had pressed a giant thumbprint into the ground overnight. Farmers found them at dawn, dew still sitting undisturbed on the bent stalks. No tracks, leading in or out. The explanations at the time were mundane and reasonable: freak whirlwinds, mating displays among ground-nesting birds, deer trampling in tight circular patterns, odd drainage effects after heavy rain. None of that required imagination or headlines. A circle, mathematically, is about the simplest shape you can make: one center point, one radius, done. There is barely anything to measure in it, which is exactly why the earliest data points scored close to zero on any complexity scale. Nobody in 1978 thought they were looking at anything worth studying. They were looking at a stain in a field. Then, gradually, the shapes stopped staying simple. Through the early 1980s, single circles started showing up with company, smaller circles orbiting a larger one, sometimes evenly spaced, sometimes connected by narrow, flattened corridors. The formations began to show something that had been completely absent before: relationships between parts. A shape that only made sense as a whole, rather than a collection of accidents. This is the point where a farmer standing at the edge of a field starts to feel a different kind of unease than the one caused by a single ring. One circle can be explained away as weather. For circles arranged with obvious spacing and symmetry are much harder to wave off, because the mind starts reaching for a very specific word: intention. Something intentional requires an agent, and no agent was ever seen, heard, or tracked walking in or out. The analysis picked up exactly this shift in the numbers. Complexity scores lifting off the floor, the first hints of mirrored symmetry appearing across formations, the visual vocabulary expanding from a single letter to something closer to short words. What makes this progression worth sitting with is what it rules out, more than what it proves. If this were simply a scattered, uncoordinated string of independent pranks, different people in different countries, none of them talking to each other, each trying to outdo local rumors, you'd expect the complexity to bounce around unpredictably. Some years more elaborate, some years plainer. No consistent direction, because human copycats don't coordinate a shared curriculum. Instead, the data shows almost the opposite: a steady, patient increase, year over year, as if each formation were quietly building on the lessons of the one before it rather than just repeating a favorite trick. That doesn't necessarily mean something non-human is responsible. It's entirely possible that a loosely connected international subculture of enthusiasts absorb techniques from photographs and word of mouth, refining their craft the way any hobbyist community does over time. That is a completely plausible, human explanation, and it deserves to be said clearly rather than buried under mystery for the sake of drama. But it's also fair to note that the smoothness and consistency of the climb, especially in the earliest, pre-internet decades when techniques would have spread slowly and unevenly, is more orderly than most analysts initially expected from a purely word-of-mouth hobbyist network. By the mid-1980s, according to the archive, the shapes had become undeniably deliberate. Circles were no longer just placed near each other. They were physically joined by thin, flattened paths, forming compound structures that resembled keys, dumbbells, and interlocking rings, sometimes with edges so sharply defined that the transition from standing crop to flattened crop happened across less than the width of a hand. Photographers began renting small aircraft, because it had become clear that many of these designs weren't meant to be understood from ground level at all. From the edge of a field, they looked like a confusing sprawl of bent stalks, but from 200 feet up, they resolved into balanced, centered compositions, clearly built for a view looking straight down. That detail matters for the honest version of this story, too. Whoever or whatever built these was either working with knowledge of aerial photography and composition, or was simply good enough at geometry that the aerial view came out balanced by design. Both explanations are worth holding at once rather than jumping straight to the more dramatic one. Then comes the part of the dataset that made the research team stop and reread their own output several times. Heading into 1990, the climbing line of complexity didn't just keep rising steadily, it jumped. Not a small step up, but something closer to a near-vertical shift in the graph. Formations before that point clustered in a recognizable band, 3, 4, occasionally 5 distinct elements, intricate but within the range of what a patient, skilled team with rope and boards could plausibly produce over a long night. Formations from around 1990 onward broke straight through that band, 15, 20 distinct nested elements, precise angular relationships holding steady across an entire field, symmetry maintained from edge to edge, with no visible drift or sloppy correction anywhere in the design. And crucially, there was no gradual bridge between the two eras. No string of transitional years where designs were pretty complex, but not quite there yet. One season the formations were speaking in short, simple phrases. The very next, they were composing something that looked like paragraphs of interlocking geometry, with no visible in-between step. The most reasonable, grounded explanation for a jump like that is still almost certainly human. By the late 1980s, crop circles had become a genuine media sensation, with newspapers running aerial photographs and a small but growing community of enthusiasts actively competing to outdo one another. Once techniques for planning, surveying, and executing more ambitious designs started circulating through magazines, meetups, and eventually shared notes among dedicated hobbyists, a rapid jump in sophistication across a short window is exactly what you'd expect from a skilled community suddenly organizing itself around a shared challenge. Skill doesn't always creep upward in tiny increments. Sometimes a breakthrough technique or a piece of shared knowledge causes a visible leap all at once. The same way any hobby or craft can look stagnant for years and then suddenly produce work far beyond what came before once the right insight spreads. The interesting scientific question isn't whether that's possible. It obviously is, but why the data shows this leap occurring in a comparatively narrow window across multiple countries rather than spreading unevenly the way local techniques usually do, which is a genuinely open question the researchers themselves flagged rather than resolved. After that threshold, the trend didn't level off. It kept accelerating, and the rate of acceleration itself increased. Meaning complexity wasn't just growing, it was growing faster each year than the year before, a curve shape mathematicians describe as exponential rather than linear. The same shape you see in the early growth of a new technology, or in a language moving from simple grunts and gestures towards structured grammar. Some of the formations from the 1990s and 2000s, when analyzed structurally, showed proportions matching the golden ratio, fractal-like patterns that repeated at shrinking scales, and, in a handful of well-documented cases, arrangements of present and absent elements that could be read as binary sequences. None of this means a message was actually being sent, and none of it has ever been decoded into anything resembling readable language. But it does mean that whoever or whatever was behind the more advanced designs had, at minimum, a working understanding of mathematical structure that goes well beyond flatten some wheat into a rough shape. It's worth pausing here to say something the more sensational corners of the internet often skip. Physical studies of some crop circle sites over the decades have reported genuinely odd details worth acknowledging without overselling them. Plant stems bent rather than snapped cleanly at the nodes, occasional anomalies in soil samples, and a near-total absence of footprints or equipment tracks in some formations. Skeptics have offered plausible mechanical explanations for several of these findings, including specialized tools designed to bend stalks without breaking them and careful entry and exit routes along existing furrows. Believers point to the same details as evidence of something stranger. Both sides are working from the same limited physical evidence, and the honest position is that some individual cases remain genuinely unresolved rather than definitively solved in either direction, which is different from claiming the entire 50-year phenomenon is unexplained. So, where does that leave the actual finding, the climbing curve, the 1990 threshold, the acceleration that hasn't stopped? The research team that ran this analysis was careful, in their own notes, not to claim more than the data actually supported. What they found was a real, measurable, statistically unusual pattern of increasing structural complexity across 5 decades of crop circle formations, occurring in a way that doesn't perfectly match the simplest assumption of scattered, uncoordinated pranks, but also doesn't require anything beyond human ingenuity, community knowledge sharing, and escalating competition to explain. If the underlying rate of increase were to continue on its current mathematical trajectory, the projected complexity of the most advanced formations would, by the early 2030s, theoretically reach a density comparable to a page of written text, which is a striking number to sit with, even while remembering that a projection is not a prophecy. And trend lines built from limited historical data have a long history of failing to hold once you actually reach the date they were pointing to. Here's the part of this that isn't really about aliens, hoaxers, or algorithms at all. It's about what happens when you finally stop treating a 50-year phenomenon as settled and actually look at the numbers behind it with fresh eyes. The most interesting outcome of this whole exercise wasn't proof of anything otherworldly. It was the uncomfortable reminder that a mystery can sit in plain sight for decades, get filed away as a joke, and still be hiding a real, measurable pattern nobody bothered to actually chart. Maybe that pattern is nothing more than human creativity compounding on itself the way skills always do once a community forms around a shared craft. Maybe it's evidence of something we don't fully understand yet about how information-dense a physical signal in a field can become before someone finally reads it as more than decoration. The data doesn't settle that argument, and it was never going to. What it does is hand you a real, honest curve and ask you to decide for yourself what's drawing it upward. So here's the question worth sitting with after all of this. If the complexity keeps climbing at the rate the last 50 years suggest, and a formation eventually appears dense enough to be read as an actual message rather than a design, would you trust what it said? Or would you assume, all the way down, that a very clever, very patient group of people had simply gotten good enough to fool you completely? Drop your answer below, because the next dataset waiting to be looked at this closely is even stranger than this one.